A few weeks ago, I was trying to better understand how the landfills worked in City Skylines 2, and I ended up on the City Skylines 2 wiki page. And while I was there, I got the idea into my head that I would sit down and read the whole thing and then share with you the pieces of information that I found interesting or wasn't aware of. So in this video, I want to go over some of that information with you. I'll start things off by talking about city development and management, and then I'll move on to infrastructure and services. And lastly, I'll talk a little bit about the natural environment and what I found there. And I'll wrap things up by giving a few general thoughts that I had while I was going through the wiki. I was well aware of how, as you progress in the game, you gain XP from placing buildings and parks and roads, as well as other city service buildings. And I did know that there was some mechanism to give you XP passively. However, I didn't know that there was a specific amount of time in game that you have to wait until you get this XP. I've sat around and tried to wait for XP to just fall into my lap before while I was simulating, and realized it took a lot longer than I thought. And the actual amount that it takes is 1.5 in-game hours. And the amount that you get is going to be based on the population that you have, as well as the happiness of the citizens. I want to talk a little bit about the map tiles. The first thing to know is that map tiles are a function of three variables. The first is the number of existing map tiles that have already been unlocked. The second is the amount of buildable area in the map tile that you're going to unlock. And the third is the amount of resources within that map tile. And those resources include wood, ore, oil, groundwater, and fertile land. The numbers on how much this affects the cost of the tile aren't exact, but what was notable is that oil and groundwater are the most expensive, and they're about 3 times as much as these other ones per unit. The other thing to note is that if you're buying multiple tiles at once, that first item in the function of the cost, the number of existing map tiles unlocked, also includes the additional map tiles that you're buying. So let's say I buy 3 map tiles. Those second 2 map tiles are actually taking the first map tile into account in their cost. And the same applies for that third map tile, is it's taking the second and the first map tile into account in its overall cost. So if you were to just buy this one map tile, it would be cheaper than if you were to buy these with it as well per that one map tile. Policies are split into 3 different types. There are city policies, district policies, and building policies. I actually had a little bit of trouble finding out exactly where these are because I really don't use them that much, but I found that some of them are pretty interesting and they could make for unique areas in your city. City policies can be found in the bottom left here by clicking on the city information tab and then going over to the city policies tab. Most of these are relatively straightforward. The one that I don't really think too much about is importing city services. I think at the beginning of the game, this used to be done automatically. But if you do want to import things like garbage management, police, healthcare, death care, fire and rescue, then you actually do have to put this policy on. And I am curious how much of an effect it's going to have on my city. So I'll take a look real quick at my monthly budget, which is right now 15,000. If I go ahead and I go back to the city policies tab and I start importing city services, you can immediately see things going into the red, and it's actually monumental. And it looks like maybe just a flat rate of what you're importing, and that is pretty absurd. So I'm not sure if that's actually just not implemented correctly or if there's something I'm doing wrong on my end, but do be aware that turning on the city services like that can really destroy your city. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this off. District policies are a little bit more straightforward as to where you can find those. You just want to click on a district and then click on this tab right here and it'll pop down the policies menu. And within this menu, there's 2 policies that I want to highlight, and I think both of them can contribute to having a very realistic downtown center, something that you might find in some European cities such as Paris, and I think other cities like Barcelona are doing similar things, and really cities across the world. And that's a traffic-free zone in your city center. The first policy is the roadside parking fee, and it's very straightforward. All it does is add metered parking to your streets, but that is something that you find in downtowns, especially in the downtown cores of cities. The other one is this combustion engine ban, which I don't actually have unlocked yet, but what that will do is it'll prevent non-residents of that district from driving fuel-burning vehicles into that district. However, residents of that district, as well as businesses in that district, can bring in those fuel-burning vehicles. And really, there's also a third one, which is the heavy traffic ban. But that's not quite as impactful because if you design your city well enough, your central city shouldn't see too much industrial traffic anyways. And like I said, of these policies, I think those 3 really are the most interesting because what they might do is increase the need for public transit in your downtown, and you can have more of a public transit focused downtown core without needing to worry too much about having the perfectly optimized public transit network. And finally, there are building policies. And there's actually only one building that shows up in the wiki that has building policies, and it's parking lots. And it's this parking fee policy. The only reason I wanted to bring this up is because it is interesting that there is only just this one building that has a policy. I've often thought it would be nice to actually have maybe a district-wide policy on parking or allow for some more ways to set the parking fees, because having to go to every single parking lot and set the fee is a little bit annoying. So I usually just end up having these at $10, which is, in my opinion, a little bit absurd, especially if you're at a high school. This should really be free. The other notable thing is that this is the only building with building policies, so it is possible that in the future we could have maybe DLC or changes to some of the existing buildings that would allow for various types of building policies, which could help the game get into a territory of being a little bit more micromanagey, which to some people might be good, to others they might not like it. And I hope that's something that, if they do, is managed well. But it's certainly something that I would find interesting, is having the ability to set things a little bit more granularly. Again, you run into the issue of it being too granular, and then it becomes too much work to set your policies on a building by building basis. So it will be interesting to see where that goes. Next up, I'll talk about zoning, and I'll start with residential. Mostly what was notable here was about density. So first, residents in low density homes actually provide more income per resident than residents in high density homes. So what that means is that for every one resident in a low density home, that resident is providing more tax income than for every one resident in a high density home. And that's really just an average number. There's obviously going to be some variation, but in general, that's how it works. The idea is that if you have a lot of space, it may make sense to put in some more low density residential homes, and the people moving into those homes will provide a lot of tax revenue per person. However, they are taking up a lot more land. So if you don't have very much space, it makes a lot of sense to maybe put in some medium density homes so that you're actually building up, and then the land you're using, while you're using it slightly less efficiently per person, you have a lot more people on that land. So in total, your income for that land is increased. The other side of this is that high density homes and residents in high density homes will share the cost of land value increases across all the families living in that home. So if we take a look at this residence right here, there's 32 households here, and it looks like, an average of maybe two or three people per household. Let's just say 2. So there's 64 people roughly in here. And that's what looks to be maybe like a 4x6 building or something. And a comparable building in terms of land use is maybe this one here, which actually only has 2 residents. So while this individual resident here is making more for the city in terms of taxes, there's actually roughly 32 times more people in this space here, and that's for the same amount of land. Also, those 64 people share the increase in land value and how that affects their rent with each other, versus these people just sharing it across 2 people. So that's how you end up getting those high rent symbols. And if you want to take a look at that, you can just go to the land value tab and kind of see where your land value is highest and make decisions on where you want to redevelop based on that. Another thing to note about residential density is that families and elderly people will generally prefer to live in low density homes, whereas students and younger people will prefer to live in higher density homes. So keep that in mind when you're placing things down like universities. As for commercial, industrial, and office zones, there are a lot of synergies there, and I want to mention a few of them. So the first is that commercial areas and industrial areas will benefit from proximity to each other, and that's because the industrial areas and industrial buildings specifically will want to sell their goods to local commercial buildings whenever possible. When your local commercial districts are saturated with goods from your local industrial district, the industrial district and its buildings will then start exporting goods to the outside world. However, those goods are going to be making less money for those industrial buildings, so they will always prefer to send those to the local buildings first. Some of the office buildings will also have synergies with industrial buildings by taking the goods from industrial buildings, such as electronics, and producing non-tangible goods, such as software, out of that input. The other thing to note about office buildings is they don't put out noise or ground pollution, so they are a great way to buffer between your industrial areas, and that's something that I've done here in Costa Noa. If we take a look, there's this kind of office park right around here that splits up our residential and commercial from our industrial over in this area. The other reason that I like this type of zoning setup is because it takes advantage of a lot of those synergies by placing the industrial very close to the office and the commercial over here. Another interesting thing about industrial buildings is that the companies that are in those buildings will periodically reevaluate the amount of staff that they need to produce the amount of output that they need to serve the community. So if I take a look here, this building here only has 46 out of 55 employees, and it just went over to 47. That was totally unintended, but the idea is that if this company is performing very poorly and not selling enough goods, what will happen is eventually the company will downsize, and if it downsizes too far, essentially what happens is that the company will move out of that building. And industrial buildings and commercial buildings, as well as residential buildings, can ultimately abandon, and if they're abandoned for long enough, can collapse. I've never seen that happen, but I guess it's possible in the game. One other thing to note about office demand is that the goods produced are actually produced for a different age demographic. As an example, this business right here is taking in software and it's producing financial goods, and those financial goods are actually preferred by adults and seniors who favor banking over, for example, media, which is something that is favored by younger adults and children. And the last thing I'll say on the city management front is that the amount of taxes you're charging for specific types of zoning will influence the level of those buildings. So say, for instance, you lower the taxes significantly on commercial buildings, what will happen is that over time, the commercial buildings in your city will level up faster. So if you're playing vanilla and you want a specific type of building to spawn in, and maybe it's level 5, that could be one way to work around that, is to set the taxes really low until you get that building type. Next up, I'll talk about infrastructure and services, and where I want to start in there is traffic. What I found notable here is that the types of zoning that you put in will influence the types of traffic you get in there, and I think that is relatively straightforward, but to see it laid out simply was helpful. So industrial will have a high traffic burden, but that will specifically be mostly industrial traffic. And the industrial traffic will go one of two places basically, and that is either out of the city to export your goods or import them, or it will go to commercial buildings to deliver goods to be sold. The other option is actually that they will go to other industrial buildings, but generally speaking, I think that's going to be a little bit lesser of a traffic burden on your city because a lot of that will be local within your industrial zone. Commercial buildings, on the other hand, will then see a lot of commuter traffic from people wanting to buy the goods that they sell, as well as some of that industrial traffic, but it's most notable that commercial buildings are probably where you want to centralize some of your public transit. And then office buildings really don't have much of a traffic burden at all because some of the goods that they exchange are actually exchanged over the internet, and that would be things like software and financial services. But do remember that some of the inputs do come from the industrial zones, such as electronics for software. You can see some of these patterns here in Costa Noa. So Market Street right here is a prominent commercial street, and it does carry a lot of traffic. Part of that is the roadway layout, but I assume that another big piece of that is the fact that there's just a lot of commercial buildings here, driving a lot of commuter traffic through. The industrial zones, as you can see right here, and then this area right here, all seem to have that orange color for traffic flow. And that is somewhat interesting if you compare it to these more residential areas that really don't have that high of a traffic flow. And that makes sense intuitively, but seeing it laid out like this and then reading about it in the wiki is super helpful in understanding the ways to manage traffic flow in City Skylines. If you've been following City Skylines II since some of the earlier trailers, you might already know about the traffic simulation. As a quick recap, what happens is that citizens will calculate their pathfinding based on 4 aspects, and those are time, comfort, money, and behavior. I won't go into detail in each of those, as I don't really think that they were anything new in particular. But what I did want to point out is that comfort specifically is not just about the comfort of the mode of transport. For example, a car versus a bus. A car might be more comfortable for some people, but it also has to do with the actual pathfinding of that vehicle. So it was kind of hard to get an example of this, but I think the best way to explain it is this street right here, Fawn Street, and then this street right here, Mulberry Street. So a decision that I made in the city here is I put a path right here instead of connecting these two roads up. And the reason that I did that is I wanted to not invite people to use this as a through street. So basically what that does is it makes Mulberry Street a very undesirable street because the comfort is very low. And the reason the comfort is low is that people have to take multiple turns to get over to Fawn Street right here. And while that may be short in terms of distance, these turns right here, it is not good for the driver's comfort. And that is actually something that is modeled into the simulation, and I found that to be pretty cool. All that is to say that if you're trying to discourage people from using their cars in your downtown, for example, this is one way to do it. It's to make their routes more circuitous so they aren't as inclined to take those routes. This in turn will also make walking much more desirable. And that's another thing I've done here is I put a lot of paths in because I want to make that a comfortable journey for people to take in my downtown area right here. The most interesting thing I found in the entire wiki, at least to me, had to do with budgeting. So my intuition while I'm playing this game is that when I set this road budget to 80%, what's going to happen is that the efficiency of my road management is going to be at 80% efficiency. However, that's not actually what happens. This is described in the wiki, and there's a useful graphic that'll pop up on the screen now. But if you set this budget to, let's say 50%, what actually happens is that your efficiency is going to be reduced to 25%. And then inversely, if you set your budget to 150%, your efficiency is only going to be increased up to 125%. So what that all means is that the most efficient point for your budget to be at is right at 100%. So the thing I like about that is it encourages you to manage your infrastructure well and place the right amount of buildings so that you have your budget on 100% and don't really need to go up or down too much, because when you start doing that, your services will run pretty inefficiently. Another thing I have found interesting about budgeting your services is the service fees, and those apply to electricity and water. So if you increase service fees, what will actually happen is that intuitively the demand from those services by your citizens is going to fall. And the thing that I didn't really know is that your citizen happiness is actually going to go down as well with that, as well as the company efficiency. So if you're in a bit of a crunch and you need to increase your service fees to make a little bit of money, just keep in mind that it is going to have those impacts on your city. Conversely, if you want to make your citizens happier and your company is more profitable, just pop that service fee down and it'll have that effect. If you have a facility in your city that is managing sewage and it's not the sewage outlet, what is going to happen is that the sewage that is processed at that facility is actually going to be produced into solid waste. And then that solid waste is going to have to be put somewhere, and that is actually going to be at your city's landfill. Not something that I knew, but keep it in mind because that is going to be an extra burden on your city's landfill. One thing you might not have known about elementary schools is that they provide an additional well-being bonus to nearby families with children. That isn't directly visible if you go ahead and look at the elementary school here. It doesn't say anything about a well-being bonus. However, if you go over to the happiness info view, you'll be able to see that walking distance to elementary school is factored in. I don't know of anywhere else that we're able to see this, but this is something to keep in mind if you want to build maybe a more upscale and expensive neighborhood. It might be useful to have an elementary school nearby. In order to fight forest fires, you're going to need to have the helicopter depot, but there is a way around having that helicopter depot if you don't want to spend the extra money to have an additional depot. You can actually get the fire station, which is more expensive up front, but it gives you other capabilities. And this one will allow you to have one single fire helicopter. I believe in one of the new content creator packs, either Modern Architecture or Urban Promenades, you're able to get a different fire station that might be a little bit cheaper and also has a helicopter. But this fire station is generally pretty useful for other things as well. It also has a disaster prevention and response unit add-on building, and that building is actually pretty important if you want to be able to repair collapsed buildings in your cities. If you don't have one of those, you might end up having to replace some of your service buildings if they get burned down, for instance, and that can be a pretty expensive endeavor. There was one thing in the postal supply chain that I wasn't really aware of that I think is pretty important to know about, and that is that the post office by itself is not going to be able to actually send mail within your city to other citizens. So if you have mail originating locally and someone wants to send it to another person who lives in your city, they're not going to be able to do that unless you also have the post sorting facility. So that postal chain basically goes like this. People will drop off mail at mailboxes. There's also a way for companies like industrial and commercial businesses to have mail picked up at their business locations, but it is going to be one of those two options for outgoing mail. Once the mail is at those locations, a mail truck from the post office will pick it up and then bring it back to the post office. This mail, if it's outgoing, is then going to go only to the outside connections, so it can't be sent within the city. If you would then want to send mail outside of the city, you're going to actually need a post sorting facility, and that's where you get the ability to send both local and intercity mail. If you just have the post office, all of your outgoing mail is just going to go outside of the city. Next up, I want to talk about the natural environment and how it interacts with your city. In the wiki, there are two conflicting statements about fertile land and forested areas and how they interact with ground pollution. On one page, it does say that fertile land and forested areas are destroyed by ground pollution. However, on another page, it says that they are merely depleted by ground pollution. I personally am inclined to think that they are probably just depleted by ground pollution, and once the ground pollution dissipates, you'll get your forested area and fertile land back. You can kind of see that in my industrial area here a little bit, that this fertile land that is up against the boundary of my industrial zone is kind of pushed back. You can see that here in my industrial zone, that some of this fertile land is being pushed back by the industrial zone itself. And if you look at the ground pollution, it is confirming that statement. In the future in Koh Sanoa, once I redevelop this area, it will be interesting to see whether or not this area ends up becoming fertile once again. But do keep in mind that the ground pollution from industrial areas and other noxious uses is going to affect the fertile land and forestry nearby. In areas with a lot of noise pollution, you may want to consider placing down some street trees or other trees around the area, because both street trees and trees that you place with the landscaping tool will reduce the noise pollution nearby. It is a little bit hard to see right here if that is actually affecting this area, but I'm not getting any sort of noise pollution complaints from these residents right here, so I imagine it is having an effect. Keep in mind though that the wiki does say that you need to have pretty dense foliage to have that negating effect on noise pollution. And the last thing I wanted to touch on is the climate. So if your map tends to have a lot of cloudy weather, it may not be as useful to place down the solar power plant, because the cloudy weather does have an effect on the power output of that power plant. And you can see it here in the description. It does say that output depends on weather. So if you have a lot of inclement weather in your city, then a different option might be better. The last thing I wanted to mention about climate is that you see a lot of disasters happening in a city that don't really make sense for the area. Like this tornado, for example, makes absolutely no sense in San Francisco. There are no tornadoes in this area. I mean, maybe at some point we'll see something like that, I don't know, but in all my time living here, nothing like that has ever happened. You do get rainstorms and stuff, so one thing that I'd like to see in the future for climate is maybe a little bit more control over what kind of disasters you get in an area, because having flooding in a place like San Francisco is definitely more realistic than having a tornado. And you see that to some extent with like a snowstorm. If there's no snow in your city, then obviously you're not going to have any sort of blizzard natural disaster. I'd like to see the same for something like a tornado. And I want to cap things off by giving a few general thoughts that I've had after reading through the entire wiki. One is that if you're interested in contributing to mods at all, it is a great place to start because they have resources on, for example, the modding toolchain, how to publish mods, creating maps and assets, and more. So if you're interested in getting involved with that, I would definitely start there. I personally am someone who's very interested in the simulation and how that works. One thing that caught my eye is how many decisions are made by agents, and that's something that I don't think will scale very well with increasing population, And I think that's a core contributor to the low frame rates and slow sim speed that you see in larger cities. And specifically, I think that's something that comes along with traffic. The agent-based simulation means that every new citizen that's going to be driving will decrease the sim speed because, first of all, there's another citizen that is calculating their pathfinding, but also every other citizen now has to take into account an additional citizen in their own pathfinding. So it's kind of a twofold increase that I think is probably happening. And my guess is that's why the simulation is tanking so quickly when you add population. That said, the simulation's depth has a huge amount of potential for being a compelling and challenging system, but it naturally requires a lot of time and effort from developers to achieve that. And I think it's easy to forget when you have a complex piece of software, and that's what this game is, it's really a piece of software, is that when you run into bugs, it can be very challenging and time consuming to find out the root cause of those bugs, and then fixing them is another issue as well. Overall though, there's a lot of great information in the wiki, and I'd really encourage anyone who's interested to dig deeper into it. There are some gaps, and generally I'd say they're pretty small, such as the exact dollar amount on how much natural resources will contribute to the tile cost. But I do hope that the devs in the community will keep the resource active and constantly improve on it and add to it as new things are released in the game. And I hope that the summary I've given is useful, but for now that's going to be it. So I will see you in the next one.